You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Lips and Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Lips and Ads. Go to lipsandads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com.
History as it happens, June 6, 2024. Memories of the Liberation.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer.
We may be approaching a fateful hour. All night long, bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of
Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Flights ahead of us dropped their bombs. The guns on the ships offshore resumed fire.
Gentlemen, I look at you and I think of the words of Stephen Spender's poem. You were men who in your, quote, lives fought for life and left the vivid air signed with your honor.
Tens of thousands of liberated Europeans turned out to say farewell. And they pledged to take care of the more than 60,000 Americans who would remain in cemeteries on this continent.
80 years ago, Allied armies and air forces began liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. The invasion of Normandy lives on in our collective memory as a historic triumph of good over evil, freedom over tyranny. Monuments to the liberators evoke this memory, the American cemeteries on French soil. French memory is more complicated, for certain things are painful to remember. That's next as we mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day on History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So when I was living in Normandy, especially researching the cemeteries through French newspapers, I started to see some patterns, and I started, and I was just looking for photographs of the temporary cemeteries. And in these photographs, there were these French women taking care of them. And I started to wonder, why are these French women taking care of these American graves? It doesn't take a genius to kind of make the connection that these French women, again, they're Norman, they had suffered.
I watched Saving Private Ryan the other day, part of my preparation here. And I thought about the mark it left on me when I first saw it. I was about 23 years old the year it came out in theaters. I mean, that opening scene, right? The horrifying violence. American soldiers cut down without a chance by German machine guns as they stormed Omaha Beach. And I do remember how I felt leaving the theater, disturbed and exhilarated by the searing combat sequences, but also feeling proud of my country or what my countrymen sacrificed in that long-ago war. I felt I owed that generation something for what they did. And that very last scene of Saving Private Ryan really lays this on thick, when Ryan, now old and gray, visits the grave of Captain Miller, played by Tom Hanks, in the Normandy Cemetery, to thank him once more for saving him in 1944.
I hope that at least in your eyes, I've earned what all of you have done for me.
What all of you have done for me. I think Spielberg wanted movie audiences to say, what all of you have done for us, to feel indebted as Private Ryan was to the greatest generation who fought the good war, and now we must uphold their legacy, of course.
Tell me I've led a good life.
What?
Tell me I'm a good man.
So when I watched this scene again, I felt differently than I did when I was a more impressionable 23-year-old. It felt more like propaganda this time around. But let's remember that moment in our culture in the late 1990s. Honoring the greatest generation was in vogue, and Saving Private Ryan did and continues to shape our collective memory of the war. Well, maybe propaganda is not the right word here, but I have been thinking about the movie differently, because I'm not really sure. Is Saving Private Ryan an anti-war movie? After all, the violence is horrifying. There's nothing romantic about it. And the characters, the GIs who are given the task of saving Ryan, spend most of the movie grumbling about their assignment or yearning to go home. There's no patriotic talk of defeating the Nazis or securing liberty.
Soldier, you are way out of line.
Yes, sir. That was one hell of a call coming to take this nest, but the hell, we only lost one of our guys going for it. I swear, I hope Mama Ryan's real fucking happy knowing that little Jimmy's life is a little bit more important than two of our guys. But then again, we haven't found them yet, have we? Have we?
Here you go. Get the hell off me. Bribing? Get up. Gear up. Fall in.
I'm done with this mission.
And just about every one of the main characters is killed by the end of the film. Yet that last scene, in the Normandy cemetery, it's meant to redeem, to uplift. You can't feel disgust or horror alone at the loss of so much life. 400,000 Americans died in the same war that made our country an unrivaled superpower and leader of the free world. So we think back on 1944 and picture American GIs marching into Paris, greeted by throngs of elated French citizens, liberated at last.
Paris, France, with a big underline for the word France. Because this old fellow, her, him, had been walking around the streets for 4 years in Paris, Germany.
We don't often dwell upon the thousands of French civilians killed in Allied bombardment, a necessary yet tragic part of the military campaign to dislodge the Nazis from cities and towns. Although the debate continues over whether carpet bombing the city of Caen was really necessary or wise, as it made Caen easier to defend. The French themselves repressed these memories. As our guest in this episode is going to talk about, to them, defeat in 1940 and collaboration with the Nazis afterward produced national shame. As historian Clarke Lemay writes in Triumph of the Dead, American World War II Cemeteries, Monuments, and Diplomacy in France, the ease and speed with which the Germans defeated the French in 1939-40 was unexpected and indeed shocking, as the French military was in fact quite strong. The lack of united leadership during those last days of the Third Republic contributed to the defeat and imposed a national shame on many Frenchmen. Lemay goes on to write, Épuration, or the purging of Nazi sympathizers from society and civil leadership, was a horrific affair, as it often took its form in violent acts of revenge. From 1944 to 1950, she writes, many French citizens endured vigilante trials of people's courts and punishments without legal procedure. People faced imprisonment and corporal punishment. Women who had been friendly with or dated German soldiers were publicly shamed by head shaving, other forms of public ridicule and beatings, and sometimes even torture and death. Acts of retribution and abhorrent shaming ran rampant in French society during the earliest post-war years. And as I learned from Lemay's book, the people of Normandy sought solace in American cemeteries, beginning with the temporary graves that were all over northern France. Something President Barack Obama mentioned in his remarks at the 70th anniversary of D-Day ceremonies 10 years ago.
At the end of the war, when our ships set off for America filled with our fallen, tens of thousands of liberated Europeans turned out to say farewell. And they pledged to take care of the more than 60,000 Americans who would remain in cemeteries on this continent. In the words of one man, we will take care of the fallen as if their tombs were our children's.
Did you know that after the war there were no memorials to French soldiers or civilians? They weren't even allowed by the government. But this would change because memory is perpetually mediated, personally and collectively. Memories that might be repressed for decades can then emerge and reshape our attitudes toward and interpretations of the history. Memories influence politics. It's why politicians are so keen to use history. Because we saved Europe then, we must continue our crusade today. You can bet today's 80th anniversary ceremonies attended by President Biden in France will serve as a rally for NATO as Russia makes war on Ukraine. Listen to Ronald Reagan invoke Cold War politics when he commemorated the Normandy invasion in 1984.
The Marshall Plan led to the Atlantic Alliance, a great alliance that serves to this day as our shield for freedom, for prosperity, and for peace. In spite of our great efforts and successes, not all that followed the end of the war was happy or planned. Some liberated countries were lost. The great sadness of this loss echoes down to our own time in the streets of Warsaw, Prague, and East Berlin. The Soviet troops that came to the center of this continent did not leave when peace came. They're still there, uninvited, unwanted, unyielding, almost 40 years after the war. Because of this, Allied forces still stand on this continent. Today, as 40 years ago, our armies are here for only one purpose: to protect and defend democracy.
We might expect politicians to peddle idealized versions of the past, but informed citizens can embrace complexity. We can be simultaneously grateful the Allies defeated the Axis and disgusted by war, or better yet, the questionable purposes for which the Allied victory in 1945 are put to use today. For instance, the way the word liberation was used during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
Every June, I do an episode about D-Day. In 2022 and 23, I spoke to military historian Cathal Nolan about different aspects of the battle, again in an attempt to look at the war realistically, not idealistically. And I'll make sure to share links to those older episodes in my weekly newsletter. Just in case you missed them last week, sign up at historyasithappens.com or find History As It Happens on Substack. History and memory is our focus once more with the Smithsonian's Clarke Lemay. She is an art historian at the National Portrait Gallery and author of the aforementioned Triumph of the Dead. Welcome to the Washington Times.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thanks for having me.
We're honored to have you here as a Smithsonian historian. We thank you for everything you do, for everything the Smithsonian does, keeping the past alive, history and culture. So now that I've gotten the nice, Mr. Nice Guy out of the way, I'm going to just mercilessly question you about your book. But
I love it.
No, your book is, as I mentioned on Twitter, now X, it's searching, it is humane, even unsettling. But before we dive into that book, and even my own memories versus history, memories of the Second World War. I was born in 1975, so I have no real memories, but we're going to get into that. Before we dive into all of that, what inspired you to write this book? What interested you in the subject? American cemeteries in France. You don't find a lot of books about that.
This is true, which is one reason why I wrote the book, because I wanted to raise awareness about the histories of these various sites. But it's my first book, and it's out of my dissertation. When you earn your PhD, it's like all those years of research and writing. And I was fortunate to be able to spend time in France.
Quite a bit of time.
Quite a bit of time, yes. I had a Fulbright that put me there for a year with the American Battle Monuments Commission as like my home office.
That's a rough assignment, I'll tell you.
I know, it was tough. Well, commuting in Paris is actually kind of tough.
Okay.
And then the Centre National pour les Recherches Scientifiques, which is the French government grant, they also funded me for 6 months, and my sort of home office was the Mémorial de Caen, which is the World War II Museum in Normandy, in Caen. But let me just back up a little bit.
Sure.
So when I was in graduate school, it was 2006, and I had completed my coursework. And like all PhD students, you get to this point where you're a candidate and you've got to finish. And so I was like, shoot, what do I write about? What is a project that carry me through? Because it's often you'll find people who never complete their dissertation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think in part it's because they're not personally invested. And so I knew personally for me, I had to really be passionate about this project. And so I have 2 older brothers. One is an Army veteran. And in 2006, he was serving in Iraq. He was a West Point graduate. And then, so he was an officer, but he was an Army Ranger. This was an early assignment for him, so I knew that he was kind of out there in the Iraq War, and I didn't have the opportunity to communicate with him because in 2006, this was like before we had really figured out FaceTime and Zoom certainly wasn't around. So there was a lot of difficulty for me to actually speak to my older brother, and of course, we're very close, so it kind of felt like not a death, but like a grave absence in my life. So I was starting to think about like how military families have sacrificed and how that's written into the landscape. And then there's this other part of me where I'm now pretty good in French. I worked really hard on my French skills. Even though I was studying American art in graduate school, I wanted to make sure that I had like an opportunity to think about Francophone relations with American art. So all of this sort of intersected, if you will, when I was searching for a dissertation topic, which then became this book. So I was searching for something that was American art that had some kind of French component and that speaks to families' experiences of war sacrifice. I remember when I went to the Normandy American Cemetery when I studied abroad in France as an undergrad, and that experience of just walking through this like vast landscape of graves, all the Latin crosses and Stars of David. I mean, it really affected me. It really stayed with me. So
the designers did their job then.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We can talk about that more.
Yeah, well, I've never been there, but I felt like I visited there reading your book. It's powerful just reading about it. So you're an art historian and a military historian.
Thank you for saying that. I feel like I'm an accidental military historian. I don't have the training. Yeah. But as you know from my other projects, I really have a sensitivity to military history, particularly as it's communicated through art.
Well, I appreciated learning a little bit about art history from reading your book because I have zero knowledge in that department. I appreciate art even if I don't always understand what I'm looking at. Most Americans are not aware, which I was also surprised to learn, but I guess it makes sense. I mean, how many people visit France, right? Yeah. But aren't aware, I think they know there are cemeteries in France, but they're not aware of all the other things that you get to before the cemeteries, the architecture, the murals, the bas-relief is what they're called,
yep.
Sculptures, statues, battle maps, the threshold, how you explain it, but also more importantly, or as important, the politics that influenced the design of the cemeteries, politics in our country, politics in France. Let's start with just some basic housekeeping. I'll eventually get to a question, Kate. So,
no worries.
Yeah. 5 permanent American World War II cemeteries, 5 are located in France right now. Is that right?
Yes. And if you want to count Suresnes American Cemetery because it has additional World War II lojas, you can. So it's kind of like a blend.
2 of them are in the Normandy region.
Correct.
They were built between 48 and 56. But these were not how it started. It started with dozens of temporary cemeteries just because there were simply so many bodies that had to be buried. Talk a little bit about that, the importance of the temporary cemeteries to the French people, because not many Americans ever visited these.
Yeah, I had no idea myself. And that was part of like the discovery when I spent time in France and, the American Battle Monuments Commission, which I'll refer to as the ABMC, they were very kind to me and let me loose in their archives. And I found this map. Actually, it was in the National Archives. I found this map of 24 cemeteries, American cemeteries in France. And I was like, what 24 cemeteries are these? Because at that point I identified the 5/6, if you want to count Suresnes. Then I realized that they were very specific to like the war and then the immediate years after. The U.S. was distinct in that they promised the next of kin this choice, and they had done so since World War I. The choice to repatriate the remains of the fallen soldier or the fallen nurse. No other country has offered that because it's so expensive.
Yeah, and difficult too, just logistically, right? Finding the bodies, digging up the bodies, which details that they didn't really want the families to know about. I mean, it's kind of gruesome, but go ahead, yeah.
True, yeah. So there's a lot of politics around it, and also the American Graves Registration Service, which had developed out of the quartermaster from the Civil War. I mean, the U.S. had really experience in modern warfare thanks to the Civil War, unfortunately, right? Like 600,000 bodies. Like what do you do with all those bodies? So the AGRS had kind of inherited this legacy from the Civil War, then in World War I, and now in World War II. So the United States government has asked all the families, would you like us to repatriate the fallen? If yes, it could go to a national cemetery in the U.S. It could go to a civilian cemetery in the U.S. of your choice. If you are an immigrant, it can go back to the country of origin. So some bodies were returned to Italy, for example. Or, and we hope you choose this, would you allow the body to remain in Europe?
And roughly, World War I, roughly 2/3 or maybe 70% chose to repatriate.
Exactly. 70% chose to repatriate. And so officials were expecting that same number after World War II. But actually, the campaign to sort of leave the bodies over there, was successful. So 64%. So it dropped, 60%.
Still roughly 2/3, but about
True.
a third stayed. And that was political, right? The pressure to keep the bodies over there was political.
That's my argument. I think that there's religious reasons as well. Some people felt that where a body is first interred, it's really a sacrilege to move it. For the research that I uncovered, it was clear to me that this was very much a part of a Cold War scenario. And the United States government was hoping to use the cemeteries as agents of cultural diplomacy.
There were also interests trying to get people to repatriate, coffin makers, right? Yeah, there were big business interests that had lobbying in Washington who would benefit from bringing all these bodies home. And of course, they dressed up their selling points in patriotic jargon, right?
Yeah, they did. And also the steel workers were smart. They went on strike. According to U.S. regulation, if you are going to disinter a body and transport it back to the United States, it must be done to regulation, to spec, in steel-clad coffins.
Okay, well, yeah, so they had an interest in driving up the price then, I guess, right?
And they benefited, And I think they learned a lot of this kind of savvy negotiating from their experiences after World War I. I think World War I kind of caught everyone by surprise, but then World War II, people were a little bit savvier. Oh, I can make money, as a funeral home or, as a steel worker. So you see more of that after World War II for sure.
Oh, capitalism, okay.
Right.
For the French, the temporary cemeteries were a place where they could form their own memories of the conflict. Why were, as I said before, most Americans never visited the temporary cemeteries? Again, we're going to get to the permanent ones. Why were the temporary cemeteries so important to French citizens who were living, in a war zone, or what had been a war zone?
This is the fascinating question, Martin. This is what spending time in France kind of revealed to me. Field research, has such a poignancy in anyone's research. So when I was living in Normandy, especially researching the cemeteries through French newspapers, I started to see some patterns. And I started, and I was just looking for photographs of the temporary cemeteries. And in these photographs, there were these French women taking care of them. And I started to wonder, why are these French women taking care of these American graves? It doesn't take a genius to kind of make the connection that these French women, again, they're Norman, they had suffered. I mean, they had lost between 20 and 30,000 people during the bombardments of Normandy, which was a necessary strategy to rout out the Germans from these communication centers that had been like Saint-Lô and Caen in Normandy.
Yeah, these are towns in the area.
These are like substantial towns. And then there's little towns too, like Lisieux. French families, especially women, had suffered. They had lost their men to deportation, or maybe their husbands or fathers were prisoners of war. I met one Canet woman whose brother was arrested at age 16 for singing La Marseillaise, and he died in a concentration camp. I mean, these women were grieving their own traumas and their own losses, but because of all these restrictions the French government placed on creating memorials to French events of war.
Their own people.
For their own people. Yeah. The Norman women didn't really have anywhere to go. So Normandy is about the size of Maryland. And to my count, there's over 60 temporary cemeteries, including the Commonwealth cemeteries, which are still there, by the way. They never did move. But the American cemeteries, there were 9 originally in Normandy, and then they, were reduced to 2. In Saint-Mère-Église, the wife of the mayor, Alexandre Renault, which you actually see him in The Longest Day.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
Saint-Mère-Église, everybody knows about Saint-Mère-Église if you're interested in D-Day. She was photographed for Life magazine at the grave of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who we know, from the famous Roosevelt family. He was the son of Teddy Roosevelt. He died in July of a heart attack, but he was part of the invasion, and he was buried in Normandy. He was buried in Sainte-Mère-Église. So it's interesting to see the response of American mothers in particular to Madame Renaud after that photograph was taken. And it helped me understand these cemeteries were like pivotal parts of Norman grieving during and then immediately after the war.
Page 38 of your book, The Triumph of the Dead. Simone Renaud lays flowers on the tomb of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., May 1944, courtesy of Life magazine. And you're right, the longest day. So the scene where the American paratroopers are dropped right on Sainte-Mère-Église and they're shot out of the air. There's a character playing the mayor, Alexandre, as you say so beautifully in your French, Renaud. And this was his wife taking care of the grave of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was played by Henry Fonda in The Longest Day. And you know what? He was a general. He insisted, even though he had he was a little less able-bodied. I think he had a cane in the movie. He was told not to storm the beach, Utah Beach. He did it anyway.
You're the assistant division commander.
And that's why I'm supposed to go ashore in the first wave. That's where I'm supposed to be. Tubby, you know that as well as I do.
Look, you're important to this operation. We can't have you knocked off on the first day.
But that's not the real reason. Isn't it because my father was President of the United States?
And a great president. And a great soldier. He led the charge of the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. So now you've got to be the first man ashore on Utah Beach.
But that's where I'm supposed to be, Tubby. That's my job.
And, the movie ends without ever finding out what happens to him. I didn't know he died of a heart attack in July, the following month after the invasion.
Oh, yeah. So. No, when I found out that he died, I was like, oh, whoa, like, why didn't we know more about this?
To the French, yeah. I mean, they lost, as you say in your book, about 600,000 people died in World War II. Yeah. But you cite someone there who said only about a third of them died weapon in hand. Yeah. I mean, the Battle of France did not last very long. In May of 1940, the Germans, the Blitzkrieg, defeated France, and then we get the Vichy collaborators. But it wasn't just that they lost the war. It was also what happened after that, all the collaboration. Essentially, the memories of the war were shameful for the French, so they sought solace with the American loss.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that complexity because the French are still coming to terms with a lot of this experience, and it's really thanks to like Henri Rousseau, Pierre Laborie. Like there's some French historians who have tackled le chagrin, as they say in French, the shame. They're trying to communicate how and why Gaullism Charles de Gaulle sort of reinvented and rebuilt this French nationalism and did it, some American veterans from World War II would say, at the cost of denying them the credit of liberating France, right? Yes. So there's this whole kind of complex...
1960s, right?
That was in the 60s, exactly, right. 50s and 60s. But I know I digress, but there's just a lot of history that's wrapped up in how the French suffered in a variety of ways. And then you kind of see it all coming out at these temporary cemeteries in particular.
But we can stay on this thread about memory because the memories start to change because of de Gaulle, right? He doesn't even go to the Normandy memorial ceremony on the 20th anniversary. Imagine that.
I know. Yeah.
Because he now wants the memory to change. No, it's actually the French. We liberated ourselves. Not quite true. Sorry, Mr. de Gaulle, President de Gaulle. But other things are starting to happen too, right? Among ordinary French people, they're starting now to remember their own traumas, and they're not looking as proudly on the Americans as they once did come the 1960s and afterward, right? Even after into the 80s, right?
So in the 60s, France leaves NATO, right? Okay. And like Matthew Ridgway went to France in 1964, and there's all these protests. And he was this big general, as people probably know. There's all these protests. And this is all in sort of the name of de Gaulle's legacy, if you will, like de Gaullism, the Gaullism of rebuilding the French nationalism. But it wasn't until the 50th anniversary. So I'm talking 1994.
Okay.
French newspapers that were more national, like West France, addressed the civilian bombardment and civilian death during the Battle of Normandy in particular. Up until that point, there was some kind of simmering kind of resentments, that came to surface like through like extremist groups that vandalized the Normandy American Cemetery with
Graffiti.
saying how many Normans died and calling Normandy the martyrs, which is so distasteful, right? Because you're doing, whoever did that was doing that in a major cemetery of American war dead. It wasn't an outward expression, if you will, in the mainstream until the 90s.
And then that's 50 years afterward. And so now they're remembering just how many people died in the bombardment. As you alluded to earlier, this was considered necessary, although the debate among historians over whether there was overkill in a city like Caen, C-A-E-N, not to be confused with Cannes, or Cannes, the film festival city, C-A-E-N, Caen, which was carpet bombed. And you make mention of something like 20,000 French civilians were killed during the invasion of Normandy, many by Allied bombing. That is aircraft and artillery of their cities and villages. As many French civilians died on June 6, 1944 as American infantrymen. After the first 5 months of 1944, so before the invasion, before any Allied soldiers landed in France, 15,000 civilians were killed in preparatory bombing for Operation Overlord. For the entire war, 70,000 French civilians were killed by Allied action. This was done deliberately but not malevolently, according to historian William Hitchcock. This is not really a question. It's more just to get a grasp of just how much devastation there was, making it all the more amazing that the French really didn't come to terms with this until, as you say, about a half century afterward. But so how did they react then? How did it change the way they viewed the cemeteries or the Americans, so to speak?
I think that the French felt gratitude and they understood it was a necessity of a war. They would rather be liberated, right, than suffer the Nazi regime. So I think they were actually really pragmatic about it. It wasn't until they had the next generation who started to question and understand, maybe in more adult terms as they became adults, what their parents had gone through, right? That's why in the 1994, West France is publishing stories about the bombardments and the death. Before that, only these tiny little towns and their newspapers were making accounts of it. So if you go into like the archives of the Caen, the Memorial de Caen Museum, there's this little town called Lisieux that I talked about earlier, and it reports about not only the devastation, near total, of its little village, but also how people were behaving. There was a man in this article that I read, there was a man who was buried under the rubble, but still alive, and he was calling for help. Instead of helping him, this other person just went in there, stole his wallet, and then kept going. And so the mayor of Lisieux wrote this editorial. Hey guys, we need to remain disciplined in this moment, in this period. Okay. And I found that really striking because this same paper published the story, 50 years later, published the story of Lucie Laborie, who lost 7 members of her family in Lisieux.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like the different reports and kind of the realities of what the French were going through is, I tried to make sense of that by looking at the American cemeteries and kind of the role that they played.
It's so hard to make sense of something like that. You have to feel gratitude that the Nazis are gone, but you've lost your entire family.
Right.
So I think the bottom line is that war should always disgust us. And we'll get into the feelings, the emotions that are inspired by the design of the cemeteries. It's not disgust. Maybe it shouldn't be discussed. Maybe people might be disgusted that I would even suggest such a thing. I guess that's what humanity's problem is, right? Trying to come to grips with war. It's too difficult to deal with the horrors, so maybe we face it another way. I don't want to sound like a pseudo-philosopher here, but...
the important thing is that you're talking about it, because you have these human emotions in response to this research. And I'm so glad that you responded that way because it's going to make an impact. Like, you're going to remember this book, right?
Absolutely.
Rather than like the books that maybe are overwhelmingly strategic with
I've read enough
battles
of those.
and whatnot. Yeah, I have too. And it's hard to remember those, but I wanted to really pay attention to how memory was affected and dominated by America, the United States, in Normandy.
Yeah. So here's a way to cross over from talking about the French to the Americans, because this one involves both. Plot E.
Oh, God, Plot E. Yeah. This is the one thing that the American Battle Monuments Commission probably does not want me to talk about, which is fine. I will talk about it. But
I mean, it's there.
So there's this little tiny town called Wazan, and the American cemetery is called the Wazan American Cemetery from World War I. Fine. I wouldn't have really gone there and spent time, but I had heard about this plot E. And no one would tell me like what it was, right? So I was like, okay, I got to go and check this thing out because this is weird. I make my way into this little tiny place and I realized that it's not really there. Like you have to look for plot E and don't tell anyone that you're looking for it, by the way. And behind the superintendent's house is this hidden plot surrounded by evergreen bushes, and it's marked by a single unmarked Latin cross, just like all the headstones, but it's not a headstone, it's just marking the space. And as you go in, you see sunken into the ground are these tiny little plaques, maybe 6 inches by 6 inches, that have numbers on them. And that's it. So it's a graveyard, but there's no identification of who it is that's buried. And the reason why is that these were the war criminals that were tried and executed through courts martial, shot or hanged as punishment. So usually the crimes were rape and murder. And there is 1 through 98.
So 98 Americans who were convicted of rape or murder in courts martial. They were executed for these crimes. Their victims were French people, French civilians. They're buried in Plot E. You also point out something that William Hitchcock pointed out in his book, The Bitter Road to Freedom, that because of racism, white soldiers who raped or looted or did whatever were more likely to get away with it. So even though African Americans did commit these crimes as well, they were disproportionately punished and also probably more prone to be falsely accused as well.
Right. I don't have a problem with the ABMC like wrestling with how to bury these men, because any war, you're going to have a war criminal. You know, It happens with every military conflict. The question is, what do you do to mark the bodies?
Yeah, because it's kind of incongruent. You have these cemeteries where you're going there to honor the dead, and then there's this little plot over here with rapists and murderers.
Yeah, and buried under numbers. It's basically the epitome of an anti-memorial, right? Like these men are completely written out of history. They don't even have names. So someone FOIA'd the government to get the names, and I think that's on Wikipedia if you Google Plot E.
Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, for those who
I'm
are
very government
not inducted to that type of journalistic jargon. But so the French, though, too, we were talking before about how it took a while for them to start coming to grips with their own traumas. Yeah. But this is a source of resentment among French today, the fact that, 80 years ago, some American soldiers did not behave very well, and there were rapes and murders.
Yeah, and they remember. So what's interesting in my research is that, I would travel to the little tiny towns like Kibu in the Manche, and there is the civilian cemetery where there's victims of bombardment, but there's also someone who was murdered by American soldiers. So the French use what's called false tombs, like they cover the entire length of the body with stone. It's a Catholic tradition.
Okay.
So along the faux tombe, it says tué par les noirs, which is French for tué means killed, par les noirs means by the blacks.
Oh, boy.
And it's 1944. So this man, Louis Guérin, was killed by the blacks. And that's very specific in terms of who.
Yes.
There were no black French people in Normandy in 1944.
So they're referring to the Americans.
They are referring to the Americans. And obviously it's really an ugly notation. I would say racist kind of memory.
Not the way you would think you'd mark a grave,
No,
killed
but they
by
were
a black.
angry enough.
Yes. So we've been through the temporary graves that became 5 permanent American World War II cemeteries in France. And the French, who really cherished the temporary cemeteries, weren't so happy with the change to the permanent, memorials, war memorials with cemeteries in France. We already talked a little bit, too, about how there were no French memorials for them to go to mourn or honor their own dead because of the shame. There was a lot going on in France politically during this time, late 40s, early 50s, fear of communism. So let's get to the politics now and how that influenced the design of the permanent cemeteries. Why did American officials believe they could, influence the French political landscape through the design of these cemeteries?
It's a great question. So the cemeteries serve as reminders to a European audience of American military power. That is my argument. Since World War I, the remains of these American soldiers are interspersed throughout Europe, not in Germany because we don't leave our dead in enemy quote-unquote territory, but a lot are in France. And so following the example of World War I, these cemeteries from World War II, those who were planning them, understood an opportunity for an audience that was captive, right? You're not going to walk in a cemetery and not be respectful normally, right? We would hope.
Yeah, we'd hope.
So they knew that the French would be respectful and pay attention, and because the war had unfolded in their own backyards, like have all these emotions. So they used that as an opportunity to communicate how powerful the United States military was. And that was through the art and architecture. So the United States had employed 24 different artists and architects, and they were kind of handed out. These jobs were just sort of handed out by the government. It was sort of who knew who. So I call it a mid-century good old boys club. My point is that this was not a design competition, right? And at stake was this commission of a lifetime. I mean, Malvina Hoffman for the AP Now American Cemeteries in this bas-relief, she earned $30,000, which in 1948 was like no joke, right? Yeah. That's a big deal. Some artists at that time were only making $3,000 annually. So $30,000, I mean, imagine, right? How significant that would be for your career. We're talking about the mid-century. So just to put it into context, artistic designs that are figurative were falling out of favor very quickly. Think about Jackson Pollock, right? He was making his first important works with his drip action paintings in 1948. And he came into his own really in 1955 when he got recognized. But this is the moment, and at least in the avant-garde, where artists were really revising how they approached art and making art. And so to see a government commission, sort of a lifetime opportunity, go to the same old tired group of artists, who do the same old stuff. And this is the group of artists and all of their network from who did the Federal Triangle in Washington, D.C.
Mid-century classicists. Is that how you would put it?
Yeah, I would call them mid-century classicists. But then I split hairs a little bit because the World War II cemeteries are more modern than the strict classicism that you see in the World War I cemeteries. They're more stripped down. They're less decorative. They're more of the architectural language of that moment.
But the design was meant to counter the idea of communism in France.
The design was to create a landscape, if you will, for Judeo-Christian rhetoric. And so part of communism was obviously to, embrace atheism and think about the collective rather than the individual. And the American cemeteries totally fly in the face of that. They are super religious, although they're non-denominational. But they have headstones in the shapes of Latin crosses and Star of David.
Which is a foreign or overseas cemetery thing for the United States, not here. Like Arlington National Cemetery does not have the Latin cross or the Star of David. Okay.
Not in the Carrara marble and to the spec. Overseas war cemeteries are really unified in their design. And if you walk through the Arlington Cemetery, you'll see all sorts of different types of design in the headstones. But the way that the American government officials were thinking was to say, okay, we have this canvas, if you will, that we can just go in and have these messages of not only American military power, but also Judeo-Christian values and the resurrection.
Salvation?
Yeah, the Judeo-Christian salvation, exactly. Like there's this whole messaging about this belief system.
Because the Communist Party, well, first of all, the French resistance was made up of a lot of communists. They did not collaborate with the Nazis. They were anti-fascists, right?
Right.
And then the French Parliament in the elections after the Second World War, we had hundreds of communist deputies. So there was a real concern there. People might be wondering, listening to this, what do you mean communism in France? But yeah, I mean, there was.
In 1945, Parliament consisted of 586 seats, of which 365 or 62% were held by the Parti Communiste.
There you go. When you wrote When I understood how the World War II cemeteries' designs emerged from an aesthetic sanitation of war's realities, I began to examine war cemeteries as a symptom of repression. What did you mean?
I know, that's a big statement. I make that argument in the context of how site specificity and memory play hand in hand, right? I begin and end the book with this experience I had with a really wonderful GI World War II veteran named Norwood Thomas, who recently passed away, but he was with the Screaming Eagles.
He passed away recently, okay.
Yeah. He went on this pilgrimage, and I had this opportunity to follow him. And at the end of the book, I asked him how he was feeling about the cemetery, and he said, this doesn't begin to describe my experience fighting this war. And he pointed to all the graves, right? And we're standing in the Normandy American Cemetery, which has thousands of American fallen soldiers buried there. He said, this doesn't begin to cover what I experienced. We paved the road with our dead.
Well, you make the point in the book that the design, it's hard to embrace complexity with the design, especially, now today we have the idea, some would say a myth, of the good war. So when you go to the cemetery and you see the statues, the bas-relief, the artwork, the architecture, you don't get a sense of the horrors of combat. And maybe that's not the right place for it in a cemetery. As your friend said, who you interviewed and you accompanied, he was there. I mean, if anyone has a right to question, it's him.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of this statement that the U.S. government was trying to make in the Cold War. We'll do this again, if necessary. We've been here not once, we've been here twice now, and we'll come back. It's not as convincing an argument if you think about all these maimed bodies that died in these brutal ways. But if the memory of them is controlled and sanitized and made to seem, I think you picked up on this, like the French didn't even really understand, when I was there at least, they didn't really believe that the graves were real graves.
Because the way they're aligned and the visual it creates when you're looking at them, I mean, I'm just going by what I read in your book, but it's too amazing to believe in a sense.
It's so
impressive.
Perfect, and it's so impressive, and it's so dignified. And I'm not arguing it's right or wrong. No. As an art historian, I'm using my kind of aesthetic understanding and analysis and all my training to point this out and to connect it to the circumstances in which these cemeteries were designed.
Matching the grandeur of the victory. I think we're all grateful that the United States and the Allies prevailed and liberated Western Europe from the Nazis. But we're dealing with now memory, which affects our lives today and in the decades after the war, and it shapes politics, influences politics. I think it's important as Americans today that we not embrace myths, that we can embrace complexity, I guess is all I'm trying to say. I'll just give you an example because I'm talking too much here. Kate
No,
Lemay.
I love it.
You're the guest.
No, but you're so smart. So
No.
I want to hear what you have to say.
It's an act. No, I have interviewed Anthony Beaver, the great military historian, but I read his book, D-Day, some of the planes, because it was such a difficult drop at night. Paratroops who were dropped the night before the morning of June 6. So the pilots, the planes and the gliders, they couldn't see where they were going. And sometimes they dropped the paratroops so close to the ground that their parachutes didn't have time to open. So a lot of Americans died that way. Or they were dropped into the flooded areas because the Germans flooded areas of Normandy to prevent troop movements. They're dropped and they drown.
Yeah, Norwood talked about that. He said, I wasn't ready for this drop to end. I think he was trained to count to a certain number and he only reached like 3.
And then he encountered a German almost immediately.
He said, I got him first. So the French bocage is like the hedgerows, right? They're really thick. Just imagine almost impenetrable hedges. And so this German soldier comes slithering down this bocage like wall. And Norwood saw him and shot him. I got him first. He looked at me. He was surprised. I shot him in the chest or the stomach. I don't remember.
I mean, I can't imagine how terrifying that must be. He was probably, 18 or 19 years old, being dropped into Nazi-occupied France. And there you are 3 seconds later having to kill someone. We also don't think of how many errant bombings there were. American aircraft dropped bombs on American soldiers on the ground frequently in France. And then American soldiers, being pretty inexperienced with unlimited amounts of ammo, were nervous about planes flying overhead, shot down our own planes over the course of the campaign. As I learned from reading Beaver's book, Green soldiers were killed in droves within minutes of entering their first encounters with hardened German units. They stepped on landmines and booby traps. I mentioned how they were dropped from aircraft so low that their parachutes didn't have time to open up. War is horrifying and it should disgust us.
Grim.
But how do you translate what I've just said into
a memorial?
A memorial.
Or a cemetery. Yeah, I mean, actually, after World War I, so there was this kind of experiment that the American Battle Monuments Commission had after World War I, because if you compare the Commonwealth cemeteries headstones, which are kind of these rounded slabs, you'll note that at the bottom of the headstone with the identification, they have an age upon death. So you get immediately that this person was 19 years old or whatever. And the American cemeteries only have the date that they died, like June 6th. 1944.
Yeah, there's not a lot of information.
There's not a lot of information.
And why was that, to depersonalize it?
The Commonwealth, well, exactly. Yeah, okay. So the Commonwealth has this epitaph, opportunity for the next of kin to choose something to be written on that headstone, whereas the World War I headstones didn't, right? And that's what the template was for World War II. But there was a 3 months after World War I in which the ABMC in like 1936 allowed for the next of kin to choose 60 letters to write something on the back of these headstones. And the families chose killed in action, which creates this weird hierarchy of death, because if you remember, influenza was a big killer.
Oh, yeah.
So there's this hoity-toityness also that they embraced, in that they were quoting certain writers that were a signal of their cultured background. And also they had to pay for the inscription.
Which was not cheap.
So on the one hand, the Commonwealth gives everyone equal opportunity because they pay for it, the government pays for it. The families really embraced this opportunity to personalize the grave, whereas American families didn't. They really created a hierarchy of death by citing killed in action, having that engraved in the back of the headstone.
Families wanted it to be known that their son was killed in action, rather than, he died because he had the flu or
infectious disease.
He did something dumb one day and it got run over by a tank.
So it didn't happen. So I think that's interesting because it does allude to some of the grim realities of warfare. But they moved away from that almost immediately because they realized what a mistake it was.
So that's why the World War II cemeteries in France don't have anything like that.
Nothing. And there's no personalization, like you were saying, because they're trying to, in this aesthetic way, they're making a very unified army of a nation. They're not allowing the individual to kind of shine through.
Talk about the threshold experience. Mm-hmm. So this is you enter the cemetery.
Yeah, this is me as an art historian trying to understand this act of moving through space, phenomenological experience. According to the original designs, you have to pass through a gateway of art or architecture in order to get to the graves. And this is only with World War II cemeteries. The World War I cemeteries, they had art sometimes outside of the cemeteries. They had battle maps outside of the cemeteries. But the World War II officials from the ABMC, plus the artists and architects, they had an idea of a message that they wanted this mostly European audience to receive, which was American military power. For example, in the AP&L American Cemetery, in order to access the more than 5,000 graves that are on this overlook of the Moselle River, you have to go through a major monument to American military power because it has the Malvina Hoffman bas-reliefs on the outside. And then on the inside, there's a chapel for meditation. But then on the left, there's this incredible battle map that was designed by Eugene Savage, who was a professor at Yale University, in mosaic. And it's this combination allegorical figure of France and the United States. So I'm saying that she's allegorical because she's definitely a Minerva, the figure of war, but she's wearing the Phrygian cap, which is the symbol of Marianne, who is the liberty figure that you see like Delacroix, liberty leading the people. This is a very French, understood to be French symbol. And then she has the coat of arms is on this crest of the United States. The seal of the United States is like her breast shield. So she's charging across France from Provence and moving up with the 7th Army, that kind of mad dash that they made to join up with Patton, who's coming from Normandy, and then to invade Germany and obviously the northern countries. So there's this really interesting kind of message that together the United States and France are invincible. Every map, every cemetery has that message.
And greeting, as you say, you don't get to the graves until you go through the threshold. This is all done very deliberately. I want to go visit because I'm sure it's really moving. I got the sense from reading your book. So what was your first memory of World War II?
Oh, God.
I mean, because we all grow up in the United States. This is the good war.
Right. Probably, one of these movies, that you and I were talking about earlier. I know that Saving Private Ryan made a big impact on me. That was 1998, right?
Yes.
So I didn't see the Normandy American Cemetery for the first time until 2000. I was there right in the beginning of this kind of fascination.
The movie kind of kicked off more interest for people
after
to go
the 50th
visit.
anniversary, for sure.
Yeah, 'cause I think I mentioned before, Americans didn't visit these cemeteries in the beginning very often. It's become more of a tourist thing lately. Is that right?
I would agree. It's definitely an anniversary thing.
Yeah.
But also, politicians are really smart, right? So Ronald Reagan, he gets into trouble because he went to Bitburg and
Oh, that's right. There are graves of SS.
Sort of paid homage to these graves of the SS. So he made a mistake there, but he used the Normandy American Cemetery as a place to speak about his policies and the Cold War.
We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here ready to protect the peace than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. But we try always to be prepared for peace, prepared to deter aggression, prepared to negotiate the reduction of arms.
My friend Sam Edwards just published this great editorial on War on the Rocks about how Biden has an opportunity with the 80th anniversary to speak about current events that I know you do such an incredible job to digest and kind of report on. It's really interesting to see how these cemeteries have become platforms for not only demonstrating American sacrifice and belief system and the high ideals of freedom and democracy, but also reminders, you know.
Well, we know the context today, right? And again, this goes to memory rather than history.
Yeah.
We remember what the United States meant to Europe in 1944-45. So today we know what the United States means to Europe as we face another expansionist, aggressive power. And, well, not Germany, it's Russia today, and Vladimir Putin, not Adolf Hitler.
Right.
So, yeah, I expect
and guess who gets to be invited and who isn't invited? Putin has been invited to the Normandy American Cemetery commemorations. Not obviously now, but in the past.
Yeah, of course, right? Because Soviet Union was our ally, and they destroyed the Wehrmacht.
Mm-hmm. And he's using that memory. You know more about this than I do, but the way that he's invigorating a lot of Russian pride right now is to think about World War II. So Biden has this. It's going to be very interesting to see what he says in the Normandy American Cemetery, because I promise you, these politicians, they use that cultural diplomacy stage of the cemeteries for their recent messages.
My first World War II memory
Yeah.
was, memory is notoriously unreliable, as we know, so I can't tell you which of these came first, but I saw The Longest Day when I was a teenager.
The longest movie.
Yes, that was about 3 hours. I thought it was so impressive, right? It actually depicts the Germans not as a bunch of bumbling fools. Unlike the movie Where Eagles Dare, which is another one of my favorite.
Right.
So this is Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton with a pair of submachine guns, kill 5,000 Germans, infiltrate a castle, and save some So completely unreal, like an adventure movie rather
Yeah.
than an action movie rather
Yeah.
than a war movie. But The Longest Day is not, well, this is the 1960s, so there's not going to be a lot of gore. There's not going to be a lot of violence. There's very little blood in The Longest Day. And we know that in Normandy, the beaches were red because so much blood was spilt into the ocean. You don't see that in The Longest Day. There are no French characters either, as far as French civilians, except for one.
I really think he's a buffoon.
For some reason, he hasn't been evacuated. He lives in a little cottage right there on the beach.
Yeah,
and the American shells start to go off from the naval bombardment, and he goes outside, or he's waving his flag inside his apartment, Vive la France, while all hell is breaking loose. Yeah. What do you think that is meant to symbolize? Because that's a choice the movie makes. They don't show the French family cowering under their table, dying from an errant American bomb. They're showing him celebrating while the bombs are going off.
Yeah. And I don't know. I didn't like it. Any normal person in that circumstance is going to go to the cellar.
Yeah. But what do you think what message do you think they're trying to send there?
Because I speak French, I understood what he said. And he would say, les débarquements. So that's French for the landings. Yeah. I'm sorry, but they did not call les débarquements.
Oh, they didn't?
Then. No, this is a soft terminology that was part of memory production. For sure. They called it the invasion because it was an invasion. You're not going to see how many warships were there, 6,000 coming at you and be like, oh, the landings. This is not realistic. But that is a French term that was adopted that I think reflects their graciousness and their decision to accept the terms of their liberation, which was at cost of martyrdom. Tiny little towns were 75% destroyed. They're trying to embrace that identity. To me, he's kind of a buffoon because they're on the second floor of this house I don't know how it survives that shelling. Yeah. Because he's
like a stand-in for, as you say, French gratitude, that they could celebrate amidst the violence. So I saw The Longest Day at some point. My half-siblings, I have 3 older half-siblings, their father bought me John Keegan's The Second World War. Yeah. No one had ever bought me a serious history book before. I was maybe 16, 17, 18, something like that. How can history be written so well? I was so impressed by him. Yeah, John Keegan was an amazing. Job. And I also started to play a Milton Bradley game. It's owned by a different company now, a franchise, Axis and Allies. Yep. But Saving Private Ryan, I'm glad you brought that up because, that movie does horrify you. It does depict the gore and the violence of war. And there are French civilian characters. There's a town that's been devastated. You see it, right, where they're living in their apartment building that's been kind of sawed in half by the bombs.
I think that was Neuville.
Yeah.
That was an actual city, yeah.
So you see a little of that. But, that's still a hero movie. And Cathal Nolan made a great point, the military historian on this show, about what's wrong with Saving Private Ryan, which is a great piece of cinema. It leads us to believe that small unit, meaning like a company of soldiers, small unit combat can actually have an influence on the outcome of the war. When we're dealing with massive theaters of war and millions of people fighting and doing all things logistically behind the front lines, etc. So what happens at, the small unit level, the individual level, I don't want to say it's irrelevant. It all contributes to the big picture, but it doesn't turn the tide of the war. It's just a weird way of looking at war when we're talking about a world
Band of
war.
Brothers follows suit, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's kind of the same
small unit combat, heroicizing the individual soldiers. Yeah. It makes for great entertainment and it fills you with a lot of pride. And
there's something really interesting about the individual versus the collective.
Yes.
And around 2000, all of that focus changes with Stephen Ambrose, and Tom Brokaw, and this fascination with the greatest generation and the way that Saving Private Ryan elevates individuals. And that's a very Anglo concept, right? This is what we have inherited as former colonial subjects of Britain, if I may. Yeah. It's just this idea that comes out of the Enlightenment that individuals have a life that can make a difference. I work at the National Portrait Gallery, so we celebrate the individual all the time. Memory, for whatever reason, gets really interested in the individual. So when I was first at the Normandy American Cemetery, I wasn't alone in asking, well, who is buried here? What was this life like? And so that's why I think the Commonwealth does a better job, actually, as a site of memory, because you understand the age upon death, and then you see the epitaphs that were chosen by the family, and you get a sense of the loss that that family endured. Back to, why did I do this project? I mean, I was really interested in war sacrifice and kind of what that felt like, because I was going through my own weird version of it, by not being able to talk to my brother.
Yeah, we should be pained by it. It's hard not to come away feeling inspired or proud of your country, I'm sure, when you go to these cemeteries. But I always say that we should be disgusted by war.
Yeah, and you don't see any of that. I mean, again, it's like you have all these emotions and thoughts and reactions and ideas when you visit these war cemeteries. And so my other argument is that if you're having this much of an experience, the art and architecture is doing its job. Imagine if our overseas war cemeteries were made out of, if the headstones were made out of aggregate concrete, really ugly. That's a vastly different kind of experience that we than what we have, which is we're looking at these places that are carved out of marble.
Yeah, beautiful architecture with a threshold, as you say. If you were just simply showing up to a field. Right.
Of numbers, like plot E, right?
Yeah, plot E.
Underwhelming.
So I'll leave you with this. If you're going to watch a movie about World War II, it's not about Normandy. Takes place in the winter of 44 going into 45. You can find this movie streaming. It's called When Trumpets Fade. It's about the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. And there are really no heroes. There's an anti-hero, the protagonist. It's the anti-Saving Private Ryan.
Tell me something. You got your shit together?
Sometimes.
What's that mean?
It means that sometimes I've got it together.
On the line?
What do you want, Captain?
The entire battalion took a beating last night. I've heard 70% casualties, but that's just talk. Whatever it is, it must have crippled us bad. We've been pulled back without reaching a single objective.
What has this got to do with me?
We're getting replacements in from the Channel. Tonight you'll be fitted with a new squad. Congratulations, Private. You're a sergeant now.
I don't want it.
When Trumpets Fade, about the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest.
I'm going to watch it.
Many men came here as soldiers. Many men will pass this way. Many men will count the hours as they live the longest day. Many men.
Once more, let's thank Kate Clarke Lemay of the Smithsonian. Her book is Triumph of the Dead, American World War II Cemeteries, Monuments, and Diplomacy in France. And in my newsletter this week, we have a special page, actually, of all of the episodes I've done about D-Day over the past 4 years. I will share that link in my newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. This is a podcast from the Washington Times.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.